Yo, what's going on, guys? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. Could Shaquille O'Neal have been a great heavyweight boxer? So recently, I ran into this video of Shaquille O'Neal, a kind of washed up 37-year-old overweight Shaquille O'Neal boxing Oscar De La Hoya. And watching this video, I was surprisingly impressed by Shaquille O'Neal's boxing skills. His jab, his straight, his defense actually look really good. Now, obviously, he's facing Oscar De La Hoya, who's absolutely tiny. Granted, a great boxer, but it was kind of a non-serious kind of charity match. Wilt Chamberlain used to do charity matches like this. Shaquille O'Neal has done a couple, and watching this video made me think, could Shaquille O'Neal actually have been a great boxer if he dedicated all of his time to boxing? So in this hypothetical scenario that we're going to be diving into today, we're going to be assuming that from the age of 16, 15 years old, Shaquille O'Neal dropped basketball and started boxing. And by the time he was 21, 22 years old, he was a professional boxer. So Shaquille O'Neal, by the time he was 18 years old, he was 7 feet 1 inches tall. He had a 91-inch reach. At LSU, when he was in college, he weighed 294 pounds. When he was a rookie on the Magic, he weighed 301 pounds. So for this video, we're going to assume he's about 7'1" with a 91-inch reach, and he weighed about 300 pounds. Now, I know a major question you might have in your mind, what about Shaq's work ethic? He kind of was notorious for having this really bad work ethic, for being a really lazy guy. I feel like this isn't entirely true, and he kind of gets a bad rap. So early on in his career, especially with the Magic guys, Shaquille O'Neal was so incredibly athletic, genuinely one of the greatest athletes we've ever seen on this planet. Throughout his entire career, which was very long, throughout all of the weight fluctuations, he never really suffered a major injury. So if he had an extensive boxing career, I think it's safe to assume that he would have never had significant injuries holding him back. Again, he was so quick and agile, guys. He had a 32-inch vertical, which for that size, for that weight, is incredibly impressive. He had a really quick shuttle, and watching his LSU highlights, watching his Magic highlights, he's one of the best rookies in NBA history. Guys, he's so athletic. He's more athletic than any other 7-foot boxer in history. So the issue with these tall, towering boxers, these guys who weigh 300 pounds, these guys who are 7 feet tall, 7'1", 7'2", they're kind of just statues. They don't have any quick twitch fiber muscles in their punches, so they kind of throw punches really stiffly. They don't have good movement. Their body is absolutely exposed to just shots. Usually you have shorter guys who are able to dip in, rip the body, and then rip a hook up top, and usually those big tower of guys fall. When you think of those 7-foot boxers, you think of those awkward white guys from the 70s and 80s and 90s who realistically would have never had a shot at making the NBA, not because of their height, but because of their lack of athleticism. Again, this is not the case with Shaq, and this brings me to a larger point regarding boxing and MMA and combat sports nowadays. I feel as though the golden era of heavyweight boxers has been long gone. It really hasn't been there since the 1990s and 1980s, and obviously dating back to the 60s and 70s. That was truly the golden age of heavyweight boxing. And for me, the reason this is because starting in the 2000s, I think people started to realize the best athletes that weighed 185 pounds, 205 pounds, 265 pounds, those guys are playing football. Those guys are playing basketball. Those guys are playing soccer. Those guys are playing rugby. Those guys really aren't boxing anymore. Those guys really aren't doing MMA anymore. So that's why you see all the best athletes in the world who could be a heavyweight in the UFC, they're not in the UFC. They're in the NFL. I think a great example of this is Brock Lesnar. People consider Brock Lesnar and Francis Ngannou to be the just most impressive physical specimens in heavyweight MMA history. We think of guys like Tyson Fury as the best physical specimen and Deontay Wilder of the past 20 years in boxing. Realistically, a guy like Brock Lesnar, you put him on a football field, he wouldn't even be able to make a 53-man roster in his prime, which he attempted to do. Not because of his size, but because of that lack of athleticism, that lack of quick twitch muscle fibers, that lack of agility. And that's what I see from a guy like Tyson Fury. No matter how great of a boxer he is, realistically, he wouldn't be able to play basketball at a high level because he's just not athletic enough. He doesn't have that agility. So this is not the case with Shaq. Shaq was so agile. He was so quick. Would he be susceptible to body shots? Of course he would be. But I think he would have been, honestly, a really good boxer. So I'm going to compare him to some guys of the 90s and some guys of the 2000s and see how he would have stacked up against them. So going into Nikolai Valuev is the most famous 7-foot boxer in boxing history. I believe he's the only WBA heavyweight champion who was at least 7 feet tall. So he was 7 foot tall. He weighed 328 pounds. So Shaq would have been lighter, more agile than a 7-foot champion. So it's possible to be 300 pounds and be a heavyweight champion because this guy boxed from 1993 to 2009 with an 85-inch reach, which is exactly the timeline we're talking about. When we talk about Shaq boxing, it would have been about from 1993 to probably 2009. So I think the fact that this guy was a 2-time heavyweight champion in the early 2000s proves that Shaq, a significantly more athletic guy, if he had the right trainers. So in this video you guys are watching over this audio, it's Freddie Roach training Shaq. If he had a guy even close to the caliber of Freddie Roach, he had guys in his corner that kept him disciplined. Obviously, at some point, I think he would have fell off because if he became the heavyweight champion of the world, I think he probably would have started becoming lazy, which is what happened in his basketball career. He kind of reached those high heights and then started to become lazy. But comparing Shaq to some of the 90s heavyweights, you had Mike Tyson, who weighed 240 pounds. He was 5'10" with a 71-inch reach. You have Evander Holyfield, who was 226 pounds. He was 6'3" with a 78-inch reach. You had Riddick Bowe, who was 275 pounds. He was 6'5" with an 81-inch reach. I feel as though a highly skilled Shaq, if he had 80% of the boxing skills that any of these guys would have, I feel as though his height, reach, size, weight, power advantage would be way too significant for these guys to overcome. The question and the main boxer I like to look at, who I think was the best boxer of the 90s and was arguably the best boxer of the 2000s as well, is Lennox Lewis. I think Lennox Lewis is a guy who you could stack up against any heavyweight in boxing history and he'd have a solid chance at winning. He was 245 pounds. He was 6'5" with an 84-inch reach. So Shaq's 91-inch reach it would obviously be a significant advantage, but it wouldn't be just a complete neutralizer. I think Lennox Lewis would be able to get in there, get his punches. I think Lennox Lewis is arguably the most powerful puncher in combat sport history. So I think a guy like Lennox Lewis might be able to take down Shaq Diesel. But other than that, do you guys really think a 5'10" Mike Tyson would have been able to beat Shaq if Shaq had 80% of the skill that Mike Tyson had? I honestly don't think so. I might get slack for that, but I genuinely don't think so. I think size matters in combat sports. I think it is a common kind of saying that size doesn't matter in combat sports. When two guys are very skilled, size absolutely comes into play. Looking at two boxers in the early 2000s and kind of mid to late 2000s, you had the Klitschko brothers. So you had Vitaly Klitschko. He was 247 pounds. He was 6'7" with an 80-inch reach. And then you had Vladimir Klitschko, who was 240 pounds. He was 6'6" with an 81-inch reach. Looking at Vladimir Klitschko's fight with Tyson Fury, granted Tyson was in his prime at this point and Klitschko was kind of at the end of his prime, but the way that Tyson beat him, I would just think Shaq with a longer reach than Tyson. He's taller, he's heavier. If he had, again, 80% of the skill that Klitschko did, I feel as though the size would be too much. So to answer the question of the video, do I think Shaq would have been a good boxer? I genuinely think if a guy like Nikolai Valuev could have been a two-time heavyweight champion, I absolutely think at some point in the late 90s, early 2000s, Shaquille O'Neal would have been an elite boxer.